Today, we are here to celebrate the International Women's Day with Ms. Carolina Rojas. Carolina Rojas is an international consultant on mining energy matters, and she has 20 years of experience in public sector institutions and multilateral banks. In the public sector, she served as the Viceminister of Mines of Colombia between 2018 and 2020, and she also served in leadership positions in the National Mining Agency and the Ministry of Finance of Colombia. She has also worked with international organizations such as the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and GIZ. Carolina is an economist from the Universidad de los Andes with a master's degree in public policy from the University of Chicago. And she is a board member of Women in Mining of Colombia. Welcome, Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the International Women's Day.
Thank you, Ege, for this invitation. It's an honor.
Before starting our interview with Carolina, let's remember that the United Nations set this year's theme for the International Women's Day as Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. As the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development, or IGF for short, we strongly believe that this theme is fundamental to our work. The large-scale mining industry is facing fundamental structural changes resulting from global trends, such as rising demand for minerals and metals to meet low-carbon transition and growing pressure to mine more responsibly and equitably. Rapid technological advances also add to these changes. We believe that gender equality is a core pillar of this transition. However, forecasting the potential implications of these changes in the mining sector on women is quite challenging for many reasons, but obviously and most importantly for the lack of data. While we know that women's inclusion in all phases of the mining life cycle remains low, the exact number of their participation is uncertain or outdated. Detailed breakdown of direct participation of women in the mining sector by occupation, by age, by level of education and skills, and by country are not available, neither for artisanal and small-scale mining nor for large-scale mining. This lack of granular gender disaggregated employment data is even more pronounced when the whole mining supply chain is considered. It is unclear how many women own businesses or how many women work in the businesses that supply goods and services to the mining sector. Moreover, we lack sufficient systemic assessment of their working conditions and salaries. Overall, this uncertain baseline makes it challenging to forecast what would be the outlook of the mining sector in the future, particularly in terms of women's direct and indirect participation in it. To respond to this challenge, the IGF launched the Women and the Mine of the Future project with its partners, International Labour Organization, ILO, International Women in Mining, and Environmental Governance Program, a program that is jointly implemented by UNDP and Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. This project will be implemented in 3 phases, and currently we are implementing the first phase that aims at collecting and analyzing gender-segregated data in 11 countries, including Colombia. Colombia is one of the very few countries that has solid strategy to improve the representation of women in the mining workforce. We can easily say that the Mining Energy Gender Policy Guideline is a groundbreaking example of government policies that aim at gender equality in the sector. As a part of the leadership team that led this process, Carolina, can you tell us about the challenges governments face trying to introduce mining policies that prioritize gender equality and women's empowerment, and especially in the absence of granular, gender-segregated data?
I think that the Colombian mining gender policy guidelines were successful because there was a combination of 4 things going on. First, there was a conviction, a belief that the mining sector required gender equality because it was going to be good for the mining sector and because it's good for society in general. Second, there was very strong leadership, first on behalf of the then Minister of Mines, Ms. Maria Fernanda Suarez, and myself. We were totally convinced of the importance of gender equality, and we pushed this agenda forward. And not only at the mining level, but also in general within the government, because gender equality was prioritized within the Colombian development plan. The third thing is that we had a very broad stakeholder engagement. The policy guidelines were constructed through workshops in 7 regions of the country, producing regions, where there was conversations with communities, with women who were actually working in the mining and energy sectors, but also with industry associations, specific women in mining associations, companies themselves. This very broad set of stakeholders was very important because in the end, all of the guidelines have to be applied by the actual mining sector. And so it should reflect their concerns and their priorities. And finally, I think the last thing that guaranteed success for this guideline was that we established a very specific action plan with indicators, with targets in order to monitor how the guidelines were progressing throughout time. And in this last part is where the absence of very specific mining gender data was a challenge. At that point, what we did is we used information that was available in the National Statistics Agency in some specific studies, but we didn't have the granularity of the data that perhaps was necessary in order to define action plans that were very specific.
Without data, it's very, very difficult to develop and monitor indicators. So how did Colombia tackle with this lack of data and come up with a comprehensive strategy for strengthening women's representation in the mining workforce?
So because this data gap was identified, the first step in the guidelines was to actually have a comprehensive baseline of the mining. And remember that our guidelines were not only for the mining sector, but also for the extractives and the energy sector. So we conducted a survey that was financed by the Inter-American Development Bank and other donors, with the participation of around 70 companies from the 3 different sectors. And it was very important because it not only identified numbers and figures in terms of the participation of women in the energy and mining sector, but also on the strategies that these companies had in order to improve gender equality within their own companies. For example, in terms of asking them questions about their recruitment policies, their retention policies, their work-life balance for their different employees. All of this information was very useful in order to identify what the gaps were. And the results are very similar to those found in other countries in terms of low participation of women. In the case of the mining sector, it was around 20% or around 30% if you controlled for the size of the company. Concentration was especially in middle management and administrative tasks, very low representation in more operational labor types of jobs, and not a lot of participation at the executive level, and even less so at the board level, which, as we know, is a very important issue in terms of advancing gender equality policies at the company level. So this baseline was very important, but I also think going forward, there's a challenge in 2 senses. One, in terms of what the continuity of this service is. This was like a one-time survey. But of course, in order to follow guidelines, you have to have recurring surveys in order to see if you have advanced or not. And also to consolidate information and surveys, because what the other thing that has been happening in Colombia, and I'm sure it happens in other countries, is that there's like a survey exhaustion on behalf of companies because they have to fill in information in their sustainability reports in countries that are, for example, reporting on EITI. There's also gender questions in EITI. Then ministries also ask questions. So sometimes companies want just to answer one survey. And so I think there's something to be said in terms of consolidating information so that it's useful for the design of these types of policies.
This is a forward-looking strategy document rather than a simple guideline. And speaking of the future, I want to learn about your view on what the future holds for women in the mining sector. The preliminary findings from our Women and the Mine of the Future project shows that women with STEM degrees prefer other industries over the mining sector, despite the higher spectrum of wage that the mining sector offers. Also, we see that women leave the sector in a higher rate compared to men once they achieve a certain level of experience. Do you expect that the increased use of technologies and introduction of automized mines could help us make the mining sector more attractive and also more sustainable for women?
I think technology and automation will provide opportunities and challenges for the participation of women in mining at 2 levels. First, At the recruiting level, which is one of the issues that is very important to address in mining policies and in company policies in general, is how you recruit more women into the mining sector. And to the extent that technology, for example, allows for less physical work and more machine operations, then this is an opportunity for women. For example, in one of the mines that I had the pleasure of visiting here in Colombia, a new gold mine, there was a very specific program targeted for women to use drilling machinery. And this was something that would not have been possible in the past when physical labor was important. So this technology is very good in order to improve recruitment, especially at the local level with local communities. And that also helps for the whole social license to operate dilemma that the extractives and the mining sector has. However, to the extent that automation removes all physical labor and it replaces it by machines, this is going to be a challenge not only for women, but in general for jobs that the mining sector creates. So I think it's very important to see how this automation does not relegate female labor, but perhaps that there is more opportunities of training these women in order to use these machines. And then the other thing that I think is important in technology and automation is in terms of retention. There is also evidence that a lot of women, especially more professional women in STEM, begin their careers in the mining sector and they move out along the way, basically because it's very difficult to attain this work-life balance when you're working long shifts for 2 and 3 weeks on different mine sites. I had the opportunity of meeting one geology superintendent once in one mine I always give this example. She was a specialist in emeralds and was telling us that she had began her career with around 5 or 6 of female colleagues, also geologists, and they had been dropping out of the mine because they had been getting married, having children, and these very long shifts were very difficult to combine with their personal lives. And she was even thinking about this issue because she had just had a small child. So I think technology could help retention in the sense of allowing for these women to perhaps do some of their jobs remotely, and then being able to during the time that when they are taking care of small children, for example. And so in that sense, technology could be very useful for the retention of talent in these very specific STEM-related careers that are necessary for the mining sector. There are a lot of opportunities, challenges, and I think this project that you're leading is very important in order to have the right information to take decisions and to know where it becomes an opportunity and when it becomes a challenge.
And speaking about the future also brings the question of climate change. International Finance Corporation recently released a report entitled The Business Case for Gender-Responsive Climate-Smart Mining, where, amongst other things, they look into how climate-smart mining can open up new opportunities for women in the mining communities and in the mining workforce. Based on your experience, what are the most promising opportunities for women in the mining workforce as we transition away from fossil fuels and invest heavily in climate-smart mining?
Well, in a country like Colombia, there's a lot of potential for these climate-smart mining minerals because we have a lot of geology that demonstrates that we have potential in, for example, copper or gold, which is used in many resources. But this is still at a perhaps brownfield, greenfield exploration phase. And the opportunity comes because it's projects that are going to begin in the next few years, that these mines will have the latest technology. And in this technology, as we spoke before, there are opportunities in order to retain and to recruit women. So I think that's a very interesting opportunity. But specifically in the case of Colombia, we also have the challenge, because we are a coal producing country, of how do you have a just transition for coal producing regions where production perhaps is going to decrease in the next few years. And that's going to affect not only the female labor, but just general labor. And how do you provide skills to these laborers in other areas so that their livelihoods are not affected. So I think the coal climate change minerals discussion has a lot of opportunities, especially in countries that are beginning to produce these minerals, but also challenges for those who already are producing fossil fuels and that need to have transitions that take into account the livelihoods of the people who live in these communities and live off these projects.
On the basis of what you have just said, do you think that would there be new positions available for women, like, for example, positions that require environmental protection and certain specialties that the mining sector didn't need until now?
Definitely. I think the whole climate smart mining agenda, of course, involves the minerals that are necessary for energy transition, for example, but also how the mining sector reduces its own contribution to climate change. And so in that case, there are many opportunities for specialists in the environmental sector or in general in the whole ESG agenda, which is going to be very important going forward, and where expertise from other sectors would be useful in the mining sector and where women could have a very important role going forward. So yes, definitely there are many options, not only within the mining technical abilities, but also more generally in the ESG vision of mining going forward.
I believe Colombia has set the benchmark quite high for other countries. And as someone who worked during all these important work, I want to ask you, what would be your advice for governments that are willing to take steps toward public policies that advance women's rights in the mining sector?
Well, I think there are several things that I've mentioned throughout this conversation. First, I think it's very important to engage all of the stakeholders, to speak to the communities, to speak to the industry associations, because in the end, the policies are just guidelines that the actual mining sector has to implement. And to that extent, having their inputs is very important in the whole building of the policy process. Second, to have information. I think this project that you're leading is very important. And I think countries should make lots of efforts in order to have this disaggregated data. I know that there are countries that are already doing this. Recently, for example, the Ecuadorian Women in Mining chapter has recently released a survey of disaggregated mining data. So I think there's like an understanding of the need of good disaggregated data in order to have good policy. So that's very important. The third thing would be to have action plans with indicators and targets so that things actually take place and you understand why and where or why things don't work. And finally, like what I said at the beginning, there has to be a very strong belief in that mining gender equality in mining is beneficial for the country. It's beneficial because there's a business case around having more women in mining, because there are larger pools of people who can work in the sector, because diversity brings interesting discussions, because it helps with the relationship with communities and the whole social license to operate, and because it's something that we should be doing because gender equality is one of the sustainable development goals, and it's important not only for men, but for women. So I think this last part is the most important thing. You have to be convinced of the value of gender equality in the mining sector and have these other conditions set in place in order to be successful in the implementation of these kinds of policies.
Thank you, Carolina Rojas, for joining me today to celebrate the International Women's Day.
Thank you, Ege. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you about all of the issues and the benefits of having more women in the mining sector.
Please stay tuned to learn more about our findings from the Women and the Mine of the Future project and follow the IGF on Twitter and LinkedIn. Our findings will regularly be updated on the gender webpage of the IGF. Thank you for joining us today.